What would you say are the before we get into it, what do you see as the biggest, maybe one or two biggest items that are on the forefront right now as it relates to understanding the times that we're in?
Well, when I look at all the different things that are going on, I think the one that most strikes me as critical for the church to understand is what's happening to our children in the government schools, with the social media, with the entertainment, so-called. Our children are under attack from all sides by Satan, by Satan's minions, by the powers and principalities, the spiritual wickedness in high places that the Apostle Paul talks about. And as parents, we have an obligation to equip them, to prepare them, and to protect them from these assaults. And we have an obligation as well to disciple them, to teach them the ways of the Lord, to teach them about God, about God's laws, about God's instructions, about Jesus Christ and what He did for us. And unfortunately, I think Christians, especially in America, but in many other places, especially what used to be known as Christendom, the Western world, have really fallen short on this. So when I look at all the different things that are happening, all the different things that the enemy is doing, that is one of the ones that I have focused on the most, because I believe it's the most significant and the most dangerous. I believe it's a gospel issue. I believe it's a Great Commission issue. Because in Matthew 28, we're told to make disciples of all nations, to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and to teach them to obey or to observe everything that God has commanded us. And we often, I think of that as like, well, that means we have to support a missionary family in Haiti or the Philippines or Zimbabwe. And yes, those things are all important, but how are we going to make disciples of all nations? How are we going to pretend like we're making disciples of all nations when we're losing in this country about 80 to 90% of our children to the world? I think God is going to hold us as parents accountable. And I think we're going to have to give an account for what we did and whether we followed God's instructions with this incredibly important responsibility, this incredible privilege that He's given to us. So I see that as perhaps the most critical issue. And all the other issues run through it, right? They're brainwashing the children with the climate change propaganda, with the ridiculous notion that the UN is the savior of mankind and is going to bring about peace. So I see that as kind of the issue that transcends all the other issues. I believe it's the most important weapon that the enemy is using to wage war on the church, on the family, on the nation. And we often forget that it was God who divided people into nations. That is how He's preparing the next generation to submit to this one-world totalitarian antichrist system. And we as Christians, we as Christian parents must take this seriously.
Yeah, there was a book that was written by Ken Ham not too long ago called Already Gone. And, he just went through the statistics of kids that were raised in church, evangelical churches. I was a pastor for a long time. Because I was the lead pastor, I was able to shape the teaching. And it was conservative. It was, I'm teaching the Bible, even as a youth pastor, in all those times I was able to teach the scripture. It's infallible, it's inerrant. Here's the evidence. My background's in archaeology, so here's the archaeology showing why the Bible's true, all the way down, right? Science and everything else. I enjoyed all that. But even in my own experience, looking back at the ministry, and even of the kids that I taught, to this day, I would say most of them are gone. They're not walking with the Lord. And so I know that for that 2 hours a week that I had them, they were getting God's truth. And so that being the case, let's dwell on this for a little longer because I think it's important. You wrote a book on this recently, just coming out right now on this particular topic. Let's talk about the danger and the true risk between, explain to me, Alex, I taught these kids 2 hours of solid truth every week. And so in one sense, I can stand before the Lord, and Lord, I taught them your truth. I pointed them to the gospel, but yet most of them are gone now. Why? How did I fail? What led to their departure, at least presently? Now we hope that they come back, but at the current moment, what led to their departure?
Well, before we started recording, you and I talked a little bit about this. The Bible, and therefore God, clearly places a responsibility over discipleship on parents primarily. Now, that's not to say there's not a supplemental role for the church. The church should be equipping the saints. I mean, the church has very, very significant roles in helping the parents and so on, and teaching, of course, the Word of God. But ultimately, the responsibility for discipling of children is with the parents. You go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and Deuteronomy chapter 11, God kind of gives you the layout of what a real discipleship program, what a real education actually looks like. And he says you should be teaching your children diligently about God and about his laws when you wake up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, when you're walking by the way, when you're sitting down. I mean, at all times, parents should be teaching and training their children. And I say this a lot. Christian education will not save your children per se. Jesus Christ saves our children. But when God has given us very clear instructions for how we are to raise up ultimately his children, right? We're just entrusted
stewards,
with
yeah.
Exactly. They're not our children. They don't belong to us. They belong to God. And if they're God's children, we ought to be, if we claim to be followers of God, we ought to be following his instructions on how we raise up those children. And so, Ken Ham, I love his ministry. He and I both starred in a documentary that was released recently called Mind Polluters. And he hits the nail on the head in terms of the incredible destruction that this worldview that is taught in every public school in this country does to the minds of children. They discredit the first sentences in the Bible very strategically, right? Billions of years, you came from slime that turned into a monkey, there is no God. And for me, that was one of the big obstacles for me taking the Bible seriously, was believing as an article of faith that was unquestionable.
Because you weren't raised Christian.
I was not.
Yeah.
No, I was raised with this diabolical worldview that we came from slime, that our life has no more meaning than the life of our pet goldfish. And incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And so when you have this worldview being instilled in children 5 days a week, 10 hours a day if you add in homework and everything else, plus then supplemented by the entertainment, supplemented by the social media, what is the church going to do for 1 or 2 hours a week? It's why we have this crisis in worldview. There was a time in America where almost 100% of people saw the world through a biblical lens. Even the non-Christians looked at history through a biblical lens, looked at science through a biblical lens. Today, Barna's research shows that it's just less than 10%. Even most pastors don't have a proper biblical worldview. And the reason why we got to this place is the enemy understood, if I can get control of the education and therefore the discipleship, I can turn them away. And these evildoers, Mondo, I've studied them for a long time. I've studied their methods. They have bragged that in 15 minutes, they can undo everything parents tried to instill in their children over 15 years. This was in the context of something called values clarification. So this was first deployed in the United States back in the mid-'60s. I think the first time it was used in an American classroom was 1966. Today it's ubiquitous. The UN says it should be used on every child in every country. And it works like this for the folks who maybe went to school prior to 1966. And I remember when they did it to me. I was in 8th grade. It was devastating. It completely shattered my trust in my parents, in the objective right and wrong. This is how they said. So, Alex, you're on a ship, class, you're on a ship, and your ship is sinking, and you all jump out into a life raft. Well, the life raft has a carrying capacity of 10, but 11 of you jumped into the life raft. And so what are you going to do? Now you got to figure out who you're going to murder. And so they'll give you all the details. You've got a teacher, you've got a nurse. Now it would be like a transgender, biracial engineer. A multi-able, et cetera. You got a lawyer, you got a doctor. So who are you going to murder so that everybody else in your life raft can survive? And I think, of course, the obvious answer would be the lawyer. What do we need? Totally kidding. So if the kids were thinking about this, they would say, wait a minute. Dad said don't murder. Mom said don't murder. Pastor said don't murder. The Bible said don't murder. So let's figure out another solution. Hey, how about I'll volunteer to swim alongside the raft for the first hour? And when I get too tired, then we'll rotate, and then we won't sink the raft. But that's not what happens, right? What happens in the minds of these children is, this is a situation where the only good thing to do is to go against what I've been taught is wrong. So we have to kill somebody. What stupid parents I have. What a goofy pastor I have. I can't believe they never thought of a situation like this where the moral thing to do was actually to murder somebody. What do they know? And so in an instant, this shatters the child's worldview. It shatters the child. And this is what the UN says. This is a good way to make children move beyond traditional notions of right and wrong. It shatters their trust in their pastor, in their Bible, in their parents, and it leads them to believe falsely that there is no objective right, that there is no objective wrong, and that morality and ethics depends on the situation, that they're relative. So this is absolutely devastating to a child, and it's being used on virtually every child in virtually every public school in the world right now. So this is how sophisticated they are. They've perfected these methods over 100 years. They're very, very good at what they do. And again, Jesus Christ can still save a lot of these children who are being brainwashed. He saved me. But the reality is parents have an obligation to take this seriously and to follow God's instructions.
And give us a 90-second explanation of what you cover in your brand new book.
So we go through the history of the government school system. A lot of people don't realize this is a new innovation, right? For almost 2,000 years of church history, it wouldn't have occurred to parents to trust their children to the government. We go through what's happening right now, the dumbing down, the indoctrination, the sexualization. We show where this is going, right? They're preparing your children right now for a satanic, one-world religious, political, and economic system. And you can prove this. We've got the documents to prove it. And then we look at, what does the Bible say about education? What did education look like in this country and throughout the Christian world before the government took it over? And so I've studied enough about education that I could write an encyclopedia on it, but I wanted to distill what I felt were the most critical things for people to know in an easy-to-read, easy-to-digest book. So this is basically 15 years of research, study, investigation on the subject condensed into something that's easy for somebody to read.
You know, what I've saw in my pastoral experience was, most parents giving they're given a tacit acknowledgement to, there's some negatives in the public school, but our public school is pretty, it's okay. I mean, but look, they're government schools, and all day long they come from a secular perspective, and I see some parents. And some parents become very defensive of their choice to allow their kids to be in the government schools, and because their school isn't that bad. And look, this isn't a salvation issue. I'm not here to condemn anybody. That's not my role. But I think when I hear that from certain parents as a pastor, that they were minimizing the true foundations of the government schools. And I use that word very intentionally. These are government schools. They are completely secular, and it's been far worse. So can a Christian, and I'm putting you on the spot here, can a Christian truly defend the idea of releasing their child 7 hours a day over to government schools?
I believe the answer is simple. The answer is no. And if you look at the other side, they understood this, right? John Dewey, who's almost universally acknowledged as the kind of founding father of America's public school system. This was a guy who was a communist. This is a guy who loved the Soviet system. This is a guy who thought he was founding a new religion in the form of humanism, which is really just the oldest lie in the book. The idea that you're a god, I'm a god, there is no real God, so we can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. Did God really say? So it's just a religion from the pit of hell. But your children are being taught a false religion. And several critical people have actually admitted this in public. So John Dewey and about 30 of his friends wrote the Humanist Manifesto. This was basically their religion defined. And if you read it, it's very, very similar in many ways to the Communist Manifesto. Get rid of the profit motive, reorganize the economy, equitable distribution of the means of life. But he also says right in the beginning, we believe the universe is self-existing and not created. Right? So God is a liar. Genesis 1 is a fraud. There is no real God. And you cannot expect that people who believe in this religion are going to have your children for 5 days a week, for 8 hours a day, and not try to instill it. In fact, they were very open about the fact that they wanted to instill this. And one of the signers of this manifesto, his name was C.F. Potter. He wrote a book called Humanism, A New Religion. And he laughs in this book. He says, what is your Sunday school going to do for 1 hour a week against our 5 days of humanistic teachings in the public schools? He says the public schools are going to be schools of humanism. What is your Sunday school going to do? And he knew the answer. It was a rhetorical question. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the Supreme Court justice who wrote the dissent, so a lot of people probably still remember 1962, 1963, they kicked the first prayer and then the Bible out of schools. The justice who wrote the dissent, Justice Potter Stewart, he actually hit the nail on the head when he explained what was happening here. He said, with these rulings, we are not creating neutrality with respect to religion. He said, what we've done is establish, was the term he used, the religion of secularism, or what John Dewey would have recognized as the religion of humanism. So we need to understand when Jesus told us in Matthew and in Luke that you're either with me or against me, he meant that literally. You know, Christians, I think many of us have been deceived into believing that there's this neutral ground and that the schools are neutral. They're not instilling a particular theological, eschatological, epistemological worldview in the children. That's false. They are, and it's not with Christ. Therefore, that leaves us one option. It's against Christ. And for parents who've been told to bring up their children in the fear, the discipline, the admonition, the instruction of the Lord, how can you say you're doing that when you're handing over your children for the vast majority of their waking hours to a government school? And I like that you use the word government. They are government schools. And it's not just any government. This is a government that slaughters millions of children with tax money. Right? This is clearly not a government we want to entrust our children to. How can you pretend like you're following God's instructions when you're handing your children over to such a system? So like you, I don't want to condemn anybody. This isn't coming from a place of judgment. This is coming from a place of, look, God has revealed certain things to us about how we are to raise His children. If we claim to be His followers, His disciples, why are we not following Him on this unbelievably important area? So I would urge parents to really be in prayer about this. Grandparents, be in prayer about your grandchildren, and go to the Scriptures. God has so much wisdom, so much knowledge, so much insight for us on how we do this right.
So let's bring it down to the rubber in the road here for a lot of people. And again, as you're saying, this isn't a spirit of judgmentalism. It's a warning in that. Again, in my own, 25 years of ministry now, seeing students, not walking with the Lord anymore. And that really is the goal. I think all of us want that. So let's speak to the parent who has children in the schools, and for whatever reason, life, just the current situation, life is there where they have to have them in the public school, and they're Christian, and let's give a starting scenario. I mean, the ultimate thing would be pull them out, homeschool them. Well, okay, I can't do that. Well, pull them out, send them to Christian school. Well, I currently can't do that. So let's make the best of the moment. Okay, what do you recommend? What advice, counsel would you give to parents who have to do it that way in the sense in the current moment? They're praying about it, but they're going to be there on Monday. What do you recommend?
Well, I would start by going back to the analogy that I use constantly, and that is the burning building. It's quite an inadequate analogy, but if your children were in a burning building, you wouldn't pray about it. You wouldn't figure out, hey, what am I going to do with my child once I get him out of the burning building? You would run into the building, and even if it costs you your life, you would grab those children and get them out of that burning building. And I say it's an inadequate analogy because a burning building will only hurt you physically. It might even kill you, right? And we would be lying if we pretended like the system is not killing children. Suicide is literally the leading cause of death in certain age groups of children. This would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Children are killing each other. They're overdosing on drugs. So many of our children are being killed by this. Over 10% are being sexually assaulted and molested by the staff. So this is hurting your children physically. Their brains are being wired wrong. They're being castrated. Little girls are being given hysterectomies and double mastectomies. They're being given testosterone injections. So the physical damage and even the death is there. But this is drastically worse than that. Right? You can recover from physical damage. What we're talking about here is these children are being destroyed mentally, academically, morally, spiritually, in every conceivable way. And so I start from the premise of there really is no other option. You must get your children out of the burning building. But to your question, I actually know two people who are required to have their children in public school. So this is an issue that I have addressed. Both of them are under court order. Unfortunately, there was divorce, and as part of the divorce settlement, the parent who wanted government school won on that issue. And so the court ordered the child to go to government school. And what I say to these parents is, look, you have to understand that your child is being discipled into a theology, into an ideology, into a worldview that is completely antithetical to everything that the Bible teaches on every single issue. On every single issue. And so it sounds kind of ridiculous, but you need to tell your children, look, everything you're being taught is a lie. And you need to do everything possible to resist those lies, to call out those lies. You basically need, every day when your child gets home from school, debrief them, find out what they learned, right, and explain, this is why this is wrong, this is why this is wrong. And one piece of advice that I would give, and I don't think anybody should see this as like, oh, well, maybe I can send my kids to government school and they'll be safe if I do this. But one thing that I would encourage parents to do who are in that situation, is a very small minority who are in that situation, is prepare your child in advance, equip your child in advance for what you know they're going to be confronted with.
Mm-hmm.
So evolution, my wife and I, we homeschool our 5 children, 6 is on the way. We homeschool, but we take the same approach. We know our children are going to be assaulted everywhere they go with the evolutionary worldview. And so from our perspective, our children need to know more about the theory of evolution than the people who believe in the theory of evolution. So equip your children, prepare your children, teach them the truth, and also teach them to laugh at some of these absurdities, right? When the teacher says, you might have been born in the wrong body, right? Maybe you're actually a girl trapped in a boy's body, and if you're castrated, then you're going to be your true self. Teach them that that's what they're going to encounter, and teach them to understand how utterly preposterous that is, so that when they hear it, they don't come home and say, Mommy, the teacher said maybe I was a girl in a boy's body. When they hear it, they laugh. They say, that's ridiculous. My mom and dad already taught me about that. I know that's foolishness. So it's very, very difficult. But if you're in that situation, do everything possible, like your child's life depends on it, because maybe it does.